All right, so today we're diving into TikTok, and its future here in the U.S. You guys sent us some articles about this legal battle that's been going on, and honestly, the more I read, the more questions I had. For those who haven't been following this whole thing too closely, basically a federal court just gave the okay to a law that could force TikTok to be sold by its Chinese parent company ByteDance. And if that doesn't happen, the app could totally vanish from the US. Like imagine waking up one morning and your For You page is just gone. Poof. We're going to break all of this down today. The security concerns, the whole free speech debate, what it means for you as a user, and even how the upcoming election could just totally flip this whole thing on its head. Luckily, we've got our expert here to help make sense of all of it.
Yeah, it's definitely a situation with a lot of moving pieces, and the implications are huge, not just for TikTok, but for
Yeah.
potentially for any app with international ties.
Okay, so let's start with the heart of the matter. These articles talk about concerns about TikTok's ties to China and the potential for data security risks. We've heard these whispers for years, but what are people actually worried about? What's the worst case scenario they're trying to prevent?
I think the main fear is that the Chinese government could somehow get their hands on data from American TikTok users. And even more concerning, some folks worry they could manipulate what Americans see on the app, essentially using it to sway public opinion without us even realizing it. They point to laws in China that basically require companies there to cooperate with intelligence gathering, which understandably raises eyebrows.
Okay, so that fear is what's driving this new law. That basically says ByteDance either sell TikTok to an American company or get out of the US market. But it seems almost impossible to enforce. How could they actually force a sale like that?
Yeah, you're right to point out the practicality of this. The deadline is January 19th, with a possible extension. And if ByteDance doesn't comply, the app could get the boot from app stores and web hosting services. But forcing a sale of a global tech giant, that's uncharted territory.
And TikTok isn't taking this lying down, right? The articles mention they're fighting back pretty hard.
Absolutely. They're calling this whole thing censorship, a violation of Americans' First Amendment rights. And they've got a point. If the government can force the sale of one app, where does it stop? Could they target any app they deem a risk? That sets a pretty unsettling precedent.
Isn't that a slippery slope argument? Couldn't any app be targeted this way in the future if we let this stand? What makes TikTok so unique that it warrants this level of government intervention?
That's a great question, and one that's at the heart of this legal battle. TikTok is trying to argue that they're just like any other social media platform. But the government is pushing back, saying that TikTok's algorithm, the thing that determines what you see on your For You page, is so powerful, so uniquely personalized, that it gives them an unprecedented level of influence over users. It's almost like if they wanted to. They could subtly nudge people towards certain opinions or behaviors without them even realizing it.
Okay, so that's where it gets really interesting. We've all heard about algorithms, but most of us probably don't think too much about how they actually work. Can you break that down a bit? What makes TikTok's algorithm so different and so potentially dangerous in the government's eyes?
Think of it this way. Imagine you're a developer at TikTok right now, and they're telling you to somehow rebuild this algorithm from scratch. Seems impossible to write.
Yeah.
It's millions of lines of code, constantly evolving, based on years of data collection and analysis. It's the secret sauce that makes TikTok so addictive. But it also makes it incredibly difficult to control or regulate. And to make matters even more complicated, China has vowed to block the sale of the algorithm if ByteDance tries to sell it off.
So it's like trying to sell a car without the engine. The whole thing falls apart without that core piece.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's a great analogy. TikTok is arguing that a forced sale is just not commercially or technologically feasible. Even if they found a buyer, could they actually hand over the algorithm in a way that satisfies everyone? It's doubtful.
And to make this whole situation even more convoluted, we've got the upcoming presidential election looming over everything. President-elect Trump tried to ban TikTok during his first term, but now he's promising to save it. What does that even mean in this context? Could he actually just undo all of this if he wanted to?
Well, it's not quite that simple. The courts have already upheld this law, so he can't just snap his fingers and make it go away. But there's some things he could do. He could put pressure on the Justice Department to delay enforcement, or he could try to broker some kind of deal between ByteDance and an American company.
Hang on, separate American user data. What's that all about?
Right, so TikTok has this plan they're calling Project Texas, where they're trying to wall off U.S. user data from China. Basically, they want to create a separate system, maybe even with servers physically located in the U.S., so that even if the Chinese government demanded access to the data, They wouldn't be able to get it.
Okay, but how would that actually work? Would the code still be updated from China? Would there be any back doors that the Chinese government could exploit?
That's where things get murky. And that's what the government is trying to figure out. Is Project Texas truly a foolproof solution? Or is it just a Band-Aid that doesn't address the underlying concerns? That's a question that experts are still debating, and it could ultimately be up to the courts to decide. And this is where the upcoming election gets really interesting, depending on who you voted for. The outcome could have a major impact on what happens next.
So are you saying President-elect Trump could actually overturn this whole thing? What kind of legal power does he actually have here?
It's tricky. The courts have already ruled in favor of the ban, so it's not like he can just wave a magic wand and make it disappear. But there are some things he could do. He could put pressure on the Justice Department to delay enforcement, or he could try to broker some kind of deal between ByteDance and an American company.
Isn't there a chance this ends up in the Supreme Court? Could they completely overturn the lower court's decision?
Absolutely. TikTok has already said they plan to appeal, and that's where things could get really unpredictable. The Supreme Court could uphold the ban, strike it down entirely, or send it back to the lower courts for another look.
It's wild to think that 9 judges could ultimately decide the fate of an app that millions of Americans use every day.
It is, and it shows how this case isn't just about TikTok. It's about setting a precedent for how we deal with foreign-owned tech companies
Right.
and the potential national security risks they might pose. This could have ripple effects across the entire tech industry.
It makes you wonder, what are the alternatives if TikTok does disappear? What are people going to do for their daily dose of viral dances and funny cat videos?
Well, there are other short-form video apps out there. Instagram Reels, YouTube Shorts, Snapchat Spotlight. But none of them have quite captured the same magic as TikTok. It's become a cultural phenomenon, and its absence would leave a big hole in the social media landscape.
And it's not just about the users. Think about all the creators, the influencers, the small businesses who rely on TikTok for their income. What happens to them if the app goes away?
It would be a huge disruption, no doubt. Some creators are already hedging their bets, building audiences on other platforms just in case. But for those who've built their entire careers on TikTok, it would be a major blow. It's like their storefront suddenly vanished overnight.
So there's this potential economic impact, the free speech debate, national security concerns, and the upcoming election thrown into the mix. It's a lot to wrap your head around.
It is, and that's why it's so important to break it all down. One thing that really stood out to me in these articles was the sheer amount of legal wrangling going on behind the scenes.
Okay, let's dive into that. What are the strongest arguments on each side?
Well, TikTok is leaning heavily on the First Amendment, saying this ban's essentially censorship. They're arguing that the government hasn't provided enough concrete evidence to justify such a drastic measure. They claim that the threat is more hypothetical than real, and that there's no proof the Chinese government has actually accessed or misused user data.
But the government seems pretty convinced that the risk is real, right? What's their reasoning?
They're pointing to those Chinese national security laws that basically compel companies to cooperate with intelligence gathering. And they're arguing that TikTok's algorithm is so powerful, so capable of shaping what people see and believe, that it could be used as a tool of influence by the Chinese government.
So it's almost like they're saying, we can't prove they've done it yet, but the potential for harm is so great that we need to act now.
Exactly. They're arguing that the risks are too high to ignore, even if there's no smoking gun. And this is where the debate about Project Texas comes in.
Right, that plan to separate American user data. Is that even a realistic solution?
It's a complex technical challenge, and there's a lot of debate about whether it would truly be effective. Critics argue that even with servers in the U.S., the Chinese government could still find ways to access the data, either through backdoors or by pressuring ByteDance to cooperate.
So it's like even if they build this digital wall, are we sure there aren't any secret tunnels running underneath it?
That's the big question, and it's one that experts are still trying to answer. There's also the question of TikTok's algorithm. Even if they separate the data, would the algorithm itself still be under the control of ByteDance in China? If so, could that still pose a risk?
This part had me scratching my head. If they're worried about manipulation, why not just force TikTok to make its algorithm transparent? Wouldn't that solve the problem?
You'd think so, right? But it's not that simple. First of all, getting a tech company to reveal its secret sauce is almost impossible. They guard that stuff fiercely. But even if they did make it public, understanding an algorithm that complex would be like trying to decipher a foreign language. It would take a team of experts months, if not years, to truly understand how it works. and whether it's being used for nefarious purposes.
Okay, so transparency isn't a quick fix. Got it. But back to this Project Texas thing. It seems like a huge logistical undertaking. Is there any precedent for something like this? Has any other company ever tried to wall off user data like this before?
It's pretty unprecedented, especially for a company as large and complex as TikTok. They're basically trying to create a separate ecosystem for American users, which raises a whole host of technical and legal challenges.
And the articles mention that China isn't happy about this whole situation, right? They've vowed to block the sale of the algorithm if ByteDance tries to sell it.
That's right. They're not playing around. They see this as a direct attack on their technological prowess and a threat to their national interests. It's almost like they're daring the U.S. to go through with this ban, knowing that it would be incredibly difficult to enforce.
So we've got TikTok caught in the middle of this geopolitical tug-of-war between the U.S. and China. It's almost like they're a pawn in a much larger game.
That's a great way to put it. And it highlights the complexity of this whole situation. This isn't just about an app. It's about the future of the internet, the balance of power between nations, and the role that technology plays in all of it.
And somewhere in the middle of all this are millions of American users who just want to watch funny videos and connect with their friends. It's easy to forget about them when you're talking about national security and billion-dollar companies.
You're absolutely right. And that's why it's so important to keep the human element in mind. For many people, TikTok is more than just an app. It's a creative outlet, a community, a way to connect with the world.
One thing I kept thinking about while reading these articles was the impact this could have on young people. TikTok is huge with Gen Z, and for many of them, it's their primary way of interacting with the world, consuming news, and even learning about social issues. What happens if that's suddenly taken away?
That's a great point. And it's something that hasn't gotten enough attention in this whole debate. For many young people, TikTok is the internet. It's their main source of information and entertainment. And if it disappears, it could have a ripple effect on their social lives, their mental health, and even their understanding of the world.
It's almost like we're asking them to give up a limb.
It's a huge ask.
Yeah.
And it's important to acknowledge that. And it raises some important questions about digital literacy and the role that parents and educators need to play in helping young people navigate this complex online landscape.
Speaking of navigating the online landscape, we haven't even talked about the role of companies like Google and Apple in all of this. They control the app stores, so they're the ones who would actually have to remove TikTok if the ban goes into effect, right?
Exactly. And they're in a tough spot. On the one hand, they have a legal obligation to comply with the ban. On the other hand, they don't want to alienate millions of users who rely on their platforms.
It's like they're caught between a rock and a hard place.
They are, and they haven't said much publicly about how they plan to handle this. So it's a bit of a waiting game right now. But you can bet they're watching this whole situation very closely and trying to figure out how to minimize the disruption if the ban does go into effect.
Okay, so we've got this intricate web of legal battles, political maneuvering, technological complexities, and ethical considerations. It's a lot to process.
It is, and it really highlights the challenges we face in regulating technology in a globalized world. The lines are blurred. The stakes are high, and there are no easy answers.
But there's one thing I keep coming back to. What does this all mean for the average person, the person listening to this right now, who just wants to understand what's happening and how it might affect their lives?
That's the most important question, and it's one that we should always keep in mind as we delve into these complex issues.
So for the person listening, what are the key takeaways here? What should they be thinking about as this whole saga unfolds?
Well, first of all, don't panic. TikTok isn't going away tomorrow. There's still a lot of legal wrangling to be done, and the outcome is far from certain.
But it's worth considering what a world without TikTok might look like.
Absolutely. Think about the alternatives. Are you happy with those? Are you comfortable with the idea that the government could potentially ban other apps in the future based on similar concerns?
And what about your own data? How comfortable are you with the information you share online, knowing that it could potentially be accessed by foreign governments?
These are questions that we should all be asking ourselves, regardless of whether we use TikTok or not. This case is a reminder that our digital lives are increasingly intertwined with our physical lives, and the choices we make online have real-world consequences.
It's like a wake-up call for all of us to be more mindful of our digital footprint and to demand greater transparency and accountability from the tech companies that we rely on.
Exactly. We're not just passive consumers of technology. We have a voice and a choice. We can demand better, and we can hold those in power accountable.
It feels like we're living in a sci-fi movie, right? Governments battling over algorithms, apps just vanishing overnight, the whole future of free speech kind of hanging in the balance.
It's definitely a plot twist, like one we didn't see coming a few years ago, and it raises so many questions about where we go from here.
Exactly. So let's shift gears a bit and talk about the bigger picture here. What lessons can we learn from this whole TikTok saga? What does this tell us about the future of the internet and about our own relationship with technology?
Well, one thing it highlights is
Mm.
this increasing tension between national interests and the global nature of the internet. We're seeing this play out not just with TikTok, but with other tech companies as well.
Mm.
Governments are trying to kind of assert more control over these digital spaces, but the internet, by its very nature, is designed to transcend borders.
So it's like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole.
Exactly. And it's creating these friction points where national laws and regulations clash with, the global flow of information and commerce. It's a challenge that we're going to have to grapple with for years to come.
And this case also raises questions about the power of these tech companies, right? They're not just neutral platforms anymore. They have this ability to shape public opinion,
Yeah.
influence elections, even control access to information.
Right. And it's a power that they're wielding with increasing confidence. We've seen this with the debates over social media censorship, the spread of misinformation, and the influence of algorithms on our online experiences.
It's almost like they've become these unelected entities with a huge amount of influence over our lives.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
It's a bit unsettling when you think about it that way. And it's leading to a lot of soul searching about how we regulate these companies, how we hold them accountable,
Yeah.
and how we ensure that they're actually acting in the best interests of society.
It's a tough balancing act. We want innovation, we want convenience, but we also want to protect our privacy, our freedoms, and our democracy.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to have these conversations, to engage in thoughtful debate, and to demand that our policymakers find solutions that work for everyone.
And it's not just about government regulation, right? Individuals have a role to play in all of this too.
Absolutely. We need to be more mindful of our own digital footprint, the data we share, the platforms we use, and the information we consume. We need to develop critical thinking skills, media literacy, and a healthy skepticism toward what we see online.
It's like we need to become savvy digital citizens, aware of our rights and responsibilities in this new online world.
That's a great way to put it. And it's not just about protecting ourselves. It's about shaping the kind of digital future we want to create. A future that is ethical, equitable, and beneficial for everyone.
So as this whole TikTok saga continues to unfold, what would you say is the most important thing for people to keep in mind? What's the big takeaway here?
I think the most important thing is to stay informed, stay engaged, and don't be afraid to ask questions. This is a complex issue with far-reaching implications, and it's going to affect all of us in one way or another. The more we understand about what's happening, the better equipped we'll be to navigate this new digital landscape and to shape the future we want to see.
Couldn't have said it better myself. This whole deep dive has really made me think about my own relationship with technology and the role it plays in my life. It's a reminder that we're not just passive consumers. We have a voice. We have a choice. And we have the power to shape the digital world we want to live in. So thanks for joining us on this journey. And keep those questions coming. We're all in this together.